I love HDMI cables. So good afternoon, and I'm actually starting on time. Now I'll see how late I finish. So what Kirk asked me to talk about was security considerations for mobile apps and APIs. Because, well, that's what we're all building these days. Who am I? I'm John DiLeo. I actually do have a doctorate. It's a Doctor of Science for some weird archaic reason about the university. As Kirk mentioned, I am one of the co-leaders for the chapter, and I run the Auckland area meetup, among other things. So how did I get here? I actually grew up in the northeastern US. I went straight to uni from high school, which I regret to this day. I did not have a gap year. I didn't get to travel in Europe or any of that fun stuff. This is my big overseas experience, having moved here. I went to a somewhat well-known university in Baltimore, Maryland, that's not very well known for its engineering school, and I got a computer engineering degree. Interestingly, I didn't do any relevant summer jobs or internships. My brother owned a business, so I went home every summer and drove a truck for him. I did, at university, spend some time doing work-study jobs that were kind of relevant, drilling holes in walls, pulling network cables, that sort of thing. I started my first job 4 weeks after graduation, so again, no gap, and I have been employed almost continuously since. And on graduating, I swore I would never return to school. And 3.9 degrees later, so my career has really had 3 phases. I graduated with that degree in computer engineering, and I was a fairly lazy student, which meant I didn't get those follow-up interviews from, say, MIT Lincoln Labs or the Applied Physics Laboratory or those other places where my classmates were getting hired. I got to work for the US government. I started out working for the Army doing simulations of military distributed computing systems, specifically command and control. They said, oh, well, you're a computer engineer, you know how these things work, come model those for us. Along the way, while I was there, I had some other assigned duties. I did tempest assessments, which are basically an overall security risk assessment for a computer when they want it to process classified data. So you answer about 50 questions, write a 30-page statement, send it off to the security office, and you get a 1-line email back saying, yeah, go ahead. I also was a Unix admin for a number of systems that we used in our work group, mainly because I was the only one who wanted to do it. I left that job and started my full-time student experience in graduate school, which I got to be a student full-time for about 2 years. And then I needed to get a job because I was out of money and had no health insurance. So I got a job working for a contractor doing simulation for the Federal Aviation Administration. And I was doing mostly modeling of the national airspace system in the US. Along the way, I did 2 master's degrees part-time, one in operations research, one in business. And I ended up doing my doctorate where my research was in simulation. So I wrote a language, and it's in quotes because it's really a Java API. That phase lasted 17 years. Yeah, I know. The second phase is when I finally started doing development. Initially, it started with tinkering. Now, admitting something about my age, I was in grad school. I had started that doctorate when Java was released. So I took a master's level course in programming languages where the professor said, hey, this Java language, this is really cool. And he made us do projects in Java. Well, I agreed with him. It's really cool. So I started tinkering. And then, of course, there was the Java applets, and HTML was really just becoming a thing, and those wonderfully insecure CGI scripts. And that was how I started doing things that could be called web development. Then, oddly enough, I got hired to teach. I was a professor of information systems at a 2-year school in the US, and they ended up having me teach the Java classes. So I had to stay about 5 minutes ahead of the class and figure out how the next thing we were going to talk about worked. And eventually, I learned enough about Java to get certified as a Java programmer and start to be taken seriously there. And then I finally got a job doing that full time. And I was mainly building server-side applications. So we had a web app, and this is in the days where you're using JSP and the Struts framework and Spring to generate HTML on the server side and deliver it fully formed to the browser. I don't know how many of you have even ever done that, since it's kind of old. And we were using heavyweight web services, SOAP and EJB2, which is disgusting. And I was doing most of this for the Department of Agriculture. So what we were actually managing were farm subsidy programs. Somebody would come into an office and say, hey, I want to sign up for this program, I have this many acres of land, and then they would proceed to commit fraud and we would send them a check. Actually, that was mostly the crop insurance program, which we didn't manage. After a few years of doing that, I shifted into architect roles, and I've been mostly away from the keyboard since. This phase lasted 18 years. And then phase 3. I started with teaching again. I moved to Kansas City, Missouri. It just so happened that the dean of a graduate school went to church with us and said, oh, you have a PhD? You should come teach for us. So I did. And the first thing they asked me to teach was a master's level course in application and database security. So time to start learning. And basically, we worked out of the Stallings data security book. That was fun. I did some cross-training. As part of the job I was doing, my day job, I was asked to go and get the GX Secure Programmer in Java cert, so I did that. And I said, oh, well, this secure coding thing's kind of cool. And then we started messing around with IBM AppScan and doing some static testing. Whatever you do, don't use AppScan. Oh, wait, I probably shouldn't say that. There are some application static analysis tools that are easy to use, and then there's AppScan. And when I'd been there for a while, and just 5 years ago, basically, I happened to be in the right place at the right time, talking to the right person, when they said, you know, the security office just asked us to stand up an application security team, and we haven't been able to find an expert in application architecture and security. You want to train up? So what's it pay? Okay, yeah, I'll do that. So basically, my interest in secure coding led to some further training and then doing some on-the-job work that shifted my emphasis into software assurance. I love the term, and it's kind of vaguely defined, but what it really comes down to is you want all of the stakeholders in your product to have the level of assurance they need that your product does exactly what it's supposed to do and doesn't do things it's not supposed to do. Now, the stakeholders in question here, of course, sometimes people care about the users, but it's very often shareholders, industry analysts, certification bodies, that all of these internal and external stakeholders are looking at what you're doing and they want to know, did you do it well? Now, I found myself in another part of the world. I moved to New Zealand, December of 2017. And this phase, now in application security, has lasted 6 years so far. Now, if you're doing the math, it adds up to 41 years, but it has not been 41 years since I left university. It hasn't been much less than that, but it's not 41. So yeah, there were overlaps. Now, I went with the quote here, but I'm sure that Tony won't agree with me about the house. I joined Orion Health in December 2017, where I am the application security team. And my office is in Orion House in Auckland. So Orion specializes in healthcare information systems, electronic medical records, health information exchange, healthcare analytics, this wonderful thing they call precision medicine, which is basically applying machine learning algorithms to lots and lots of data. And for obvious reasons, the protection of personal health information has to be a high priority, or at least it has to look like it is. We have customers around the world. District and regional health boards, including quite possibly the health board that has your data. Private health insurers, that's mostly in the US. Hospitals, and a few other players that are using different products. Now, one of the reasons that I bring that up in the context of security is because we have to deal with the restrictions, the regulations, legislative requirements in multiple jurisdictions. And when you deal with trying to assess the overall security practices of your organization, each of these jurisdictions is going to ask you to use some set of standards. So then we have to make sure that our practices, our policies, our processes, the training that we use are seen as compliant with all of them. And that's, well, it's probably about a 4-person full-time job, so we have one. As a sidebar, we are hiring. Currently, we have just over 650 total staff. Development takes place in Auckland, Christchurch, Canberra, Bangkok, and Montreal. Bangkok happens to be the only .NET shop. Everything else is not .NET. And then we have implementation teams all over the place. Currently, we have a recruitment going on for intern and graduate developers, and it's being done through Summer of Tech. I actually got these dates on Friday, so they should be good. They're already reviewing CVs, so if you would like to apply to work at Orion, get in there, register, get your CV submitted, and then if you're selected, the interviews will be in Auckland on the 17th of September. They're planning to get offers out very early October with a start not much after that. Back from the sidebar. So after doing all of this, along the way, I moved into application security, and then I got involved in OWASP, and there went the rest of my time. I started out in the OWASP Kansas City chapter. I started attending their monthly meetups where I spoke up. Well, one of the things you learn is if you speak up at a meeting, the next thing you know, you're asked to join the committee. So I joined the chapter steering committee, and we started helping out planning the events. I moved to New Zealand, as I mentioned, December of 17. If you know him, it just so happens that Nick Malcolm, the previous Auckland area leader, was moving to Wellington in March of 18. So I showed up at OWASP New Zealand Day in February, said, hey, I'm here, I'd like to help out, to which Kirk and Kim said, congratulations. In the last year or so, I've actually gotten involved in OWASP projects. And this is where I'll make one of my OWASP pitches in this talk. I got involved with the software assurance maturity model, well, because I wanted to use the model and I had some questions about it. So I contacted one of the people that I had seen present about the model at an OWASP meetup. Actually, it was in the London meetup. I watched the video. And I asked him questions. And after we talked for a while, he said, so are you coming to the Open Security Summit? No, what's that? And I found out about the summit. It was in London. And then I talked to him a little bit more and said, well, yeah, I'd really love to come and I'd be happy to help out. Is there funding? and I got a free trip to the Security Summit last June. There, I joined the core team of the SAM project, spent the week writing. So the SAM document, this model, which talks about how to do software assurance and prescribes the kinds of practices that your organization, which could be your team or it could be your entire company, should be employing, is basically a committee-written document that's been evolving over the last couple of years. And we expect to have the big major release, version 2.0, on the streets by the end of the year. So we actually have another face-to-face meeting in November that I'll be traveling for. While I was at that Open Security Summit a year ago, I started asking questions about, well, does OWASP have a project to talk about application security curricula? And the answer was, no, we don't. So I proposed one. Well, it turned out that somebody else had proposed one at the same time. His was focused on undergraduate and postgraduate curricula, and mine was focused on professional training, like staff training. So we took our two proposals, merged them together, and now we're co-leaders. And now we have to do something. Okay. Now, talk some more about OWASP activities. You gave me the floor. Sorry, Kirk. Oh, great. Then I'll start talking even faster. So a couple of things about OWASP activities. There are 3 global AppSec conferences every year. There was one in Tel Aviv in May. There are 2 in September, one in Amsterdam and one in Washington, D.C. Next year there will be 3. Again, there will be one in the Americas, one in the EMEA region, and one in APAC. The only one they've really talked about where it's going to be is the APAC one, so mark your calendars. It's going to be in Tokyo in December. There are regional conferences. So the Sydney chapter is doing AppSec Days Sydney, end of October, 1st of November. It's already been mentioned that we have meetups that go on in Auckland, Christchurch, and Wellington. They're in alphabetical order. Oh. I think there is a conference in Melbourne, but AppSec Days I thought was in Sydney. Okay. And I've included the links here so when the slides are shared, you can join the chapter mailing list, you can get on the OWASP NZ Slack if you're interested. Talk a little bit more about New Zealand Day. The next one is in February again. It's still free for the conference, which will be on Friday the 21st. We have 2 days of training. At this point, the CFP and CFT haven't opened yet, so I can't tell you what the training will be. We will have some travel, I call them in quotes, scholarships, for mainly students, unwaged, underrepresented population members to get to Auckland for the conference. And those applications will open on the 1st of December. We do have the training. The fees are higher this year. And there's actually a reason. I got a nasty email from someone at OWASP who said, you're not allowed to give the trainers 50% of the fees. It has to be only 40%. Oh. So in order not to reduce the trainers' collections, we raised the fees. So they went from 500 to 625, so the 40% is now the same as the 50% was. But watch for future news. In the sponsorship packages, we're now giving training passes to the sponsors, and they're free to do whatever they would like with them. They are completely transferable. The only thing they can't do is resell them. So some of the sponsors might decide that they want to do something with those training passes. And here are our sponsors to date. Yes, I actually did get a commitment from Lateral that they will be a sponsor. I don't know at what level yet. And now this, something mobile app security. First, the links to the OWASP resources. So you have those links. The OWASP Mobile Top 10 talks about the 5 most prevalent security vulnerabilities in mobile apps. I'm not going to go through them here. I'm going to refer to them a good bit in the coming slides. So I couldn't find a nice, neat diagram about the whole process of installing an app and then starting to use it. So this is really the client-side app diagram. But when you think about it, a client-side application, also known as a single-page app, and a mobile app, they have a lot in common. So there's this emphasis on user experience. You're trying to do a responsive, performant design. You have the business logic residing in the end user's device, whether it's the client browser or on your phone. And then you're relying heavily on back-end service calls. These days, REST calls with JSON being returned to obtain your data as well as to persist data. So while I'm going to be referencing a mobile app, really it applies to both. So a few considerations, just a few. I went around, I looked at a number of web pages that said, top 5 considerations, top 7 considerations, and most of these show up. And of course, I then put security and privacy at the top because that's where it belongs. But you're concerned about user experience, you're concerned about performance, you have to make decisions about what platforms to support, you need to know what your testing approach is going to be. If this app is intended to make money, you have to figure out how that's going to happen. Now, I guess I would divide apps into really 2 categories. There's the category where the app is the thing that is meant to make you money. So think about games and all of these things with in-app purchases that are intended to get your money from you a couple dollars at a time. And then there are apps that are designed and developed by vendors in order to be a companion to the thing you actually pay for. So at Orion Health, we have just a couple of apps we've built. And the app is basically free because the customer, in order to use the app, has to have paid for one of our products. So we don't monetize the app. The app is sort of a bonus feature. And then, of course, you really want to be concerned about future-proofing, especially from a security perspective, making sure that you can handle updates. So then I thought, well, what should I worry about with an app? Well, what's in your threat model? And thank you for setting this up, Chloe. I'm going to talk through some of the things we should worry about by borrowing from the 4 questions approach, which Chloe referenced. First, what are we building? And then, what could go wrong? What can we do about that? And then the last question is, how did we do? So if you decide we're going to implement a control, question 4 is, did we implement it correctly? Was it the right control? And oh, by the way, is our model correct? So in this case, what we're building, for simplicity, we'll just look at this and say, well, we have the app. But the app is not a single thing. It's your code, which is usually proprietary, and you would like to keep it secret. You've got the platform and the build system you've used to put it together. You've got all the third-party libraries you're using. And of course, in the case of like the NPM environment, that can be thousands of libraries because you've included one dependency. You have to think about what you're doing for local data storage, and then what functions of the device you're going to interact with and what APIs you need to do in order to accomplish that. Then you need to be able to transact data, so you're going to be connecting to some REST APIs that will need to be written on the server side. And then there are the data. So for this purpose, I'm thinking about there's the data about your users. There's the data about the subjects of your app. So if you're, say, managing a health information app, then this would be the patients, the actual record data about patients. If you're doing a game, then you probably won't have subject data. And then there are the transactions. Now, if you're talking about a monetized app, these transactions might be, which mods have they paid for? Which upgrades did they buy? I like to play Ticket to Ride on my Kindle. and I constantly get ads to spend another $2 to buy another map. Well, then they have to keep track of which maps I've paid for. So that would be my transaction data. So, going through some of these, and I'm pretty sure I won't get through all of them, on our source code. Well, first thing that could go wrong is we could have insecure code. It could contain injection vulnerabilities. We might have gone ahead and built our own encryption or authorization. AuthX is both authorization, AuthZ, and authentication, AuthN. So we might have gone ahead and built our own, even though we should know better. We could have any of the classic memory management buffer overflow problems. And a key one that we often miss is that we might have a test mode or some test code or maybe hardwired demo creds built into the delivered system. That does happen much more than anyone would like to admit. And these are the top 10 elements that this relates to. Now, how might we go about mitigating these? And one of the things that I'm talking about here, I'm not looking into the feasibility or trying to measure the risk decision, just what are our options for mitigating? Well, in this case, don't do that. Don't code insecurely. So make sure that your developers are properly trained, that they're aware of what they should do. Have secure coding standards. If you're talking about a large organization that's developing a lot of apps, then it's worthwhile for them to develop some internal shared libraries so that applications do the same things the same way by calling the same API. And if a vulnerability is discovered, then you have one library to update. Get that automated security testing in there. Choose an easy-to-use tool. And of course, code reviews. Now you have to think about, so that was, we unintentionally did something that's insecure. In this thread is, somebody intentionally modified the application for some malicious purpose. Now, what could have been modified could be the source code in the repo. It might be that the executable app was tampered with. It might be the case that someone has set up an unauthorized redistribution channel and that contains the tampered app. Well, let's not make our code repositories public. And let's make sure that we know who has access, especially write access. We want to restrict access to the build and publish pipeline to make sure that what is built and delivered as a release and uploaded to the store for sale or for download contains only the code that we expected it to. If someone has access to your build pipeline, then something can be injected there, and no amount of source code review is going to find that. There should be separation of duties in release approvals. So one of the things about some of these is that you'll notice there's a certain level of mistrust in the developers. Sorry, that happens. That you want to make sure that it is not possible for someone who has their own agenda. Perhaps they've already been told they don't have a job 4 weeks from now. Or maybe they've been hired by a competitor in order to disrupt your business. You want to make sure that someone who has an agenda like that doesn't have the ability to act on it. Now, if it turns out that no one ever has that agenda, well, it's just part of your process and you go through the separation of duties and approval processes anyway. You use application signing to make sure that the thing in the store is the thing that you uploaded. Make sure that you're distributing only through reputable stores. And then I've added this thing about provenance checking. So this idea that if somebody creates a fake distribution channel and someone gets your app from that channel, is there a way that when they try to communicate with your back-end server, you can detect that and say, no, sorry, that's not a legitimate app. theft of your code. So one of the things here, of course, is you want to consider anti-reverse engineering techniques. Now, security through obscurity is a bad thing. Not having your trade secrets stolen is a good thing. So there's a balance here that you like to have open source code because many eyes help to find issues and help to have them corrected. But when you're talking about the next big thing in an app, you don't want that trade secret getting out. So you go through anti-reverse engineering techniques, code obfuscation, minification, and so on, in an attempt to make it harder to reverse engineer what your design was. Something else that often gets overlooked, deal with joiners, movers, and leavers. I have in fact left organizations where I found out I still had admin access 2 years later. That can't happen. And the only way to prevent it is to have a robust process so that when somebody has their last day, while they're at their leaving drinks, their access is turned off. Well, you also want to protect yourself from corruption or destruction. You could lose the entire code base. You could lose recent work. Now, someone I was friends with when I was living in the US had been working on a project for weeks, had about 4 weeks of uncommitted changes on his laptop when he was in a car accident and the hard drive was destroyed. Don't do that. They had a source code repository. He kind of knew he should have been doing commits, but he just never did. So the company basically lost not just the 4 weeks of his paid time, but the 4 weeks in the project timeline because they weren't able to recover it. You also want to protect yourself from the loss of expert knowledge. Oops. And that comes down to do not skip documentation to save time. Because that guy who knows how that particular module works might get a better job next week. And if he skipped the documentation in order to meet a deadline and then leaves without ever documenting it, one of the things that I like to point out is that maintainable code makes for secure code. If it's not maintainable, nobody wants to touch it. If they refuse to touch it, you can't patch it. And if you can't patch it, it stays vulnerable. And again, JML processes come in here. All right, I probably have time for one more. Actually, no, I don't. So I went through a whole bunch of them, and I'll give you the whole slide deck. But one that I thought was interesting is, well, you've got these REST APIs, and you've come up with some clever authentication system, and you have an authorization mechanism in place. You're probably using OAuth tokens, maybe some sort of API keys. And then the guy's phone gets stolen. Now, for many phones, not all, it's fairly trivial if you have unrestricted access to the device to get it unlocked. And it depends on what locking mechanism they've chosen to use, how complex a password they chose, if they're just using the 4-digit PIN and so on. But assume it gets unlocked. At that point, they are that user, and they can do whatever they want in your app, including browse your entire customer database or whatever that user could access, unless you do something about it. So requiring additional local authentication, like a PIN or a hardware token, something else that you have to have or know in addition to holding the device. And then make sure that you've allowed for disabling their access once they report that they've lost their phone. There are vendors that if you say, hey, I need to disable access to the app, oh yeah, sorry, we don't have that ability. Okay, I want to talk about privacy because, well, I want to talk about privacy. We have an obligation to protect customers' data. if it's their personally identifiable information, their name, address, date of birth, tax ID number, whatever we've had to collect, bank and credit card information, PCI DSS comes into play, and depending on where you are, the penalties for a data breach vary, but they can be steep. So you need to take it seriously. So, when you're thinking about collecting a piece of data, and I was getting upset because my thunder was being stolen, always ask, do we really need it? If you don't collect it, it can't be misused or lost. If you don't store it, it won't be in the data breach when you're breached. If you don't sell or share it, it won't be in their data breach. So think about this. When you say, oh, well, we're going to collect all this demographic information from the user when they sign up, do you really need it? And I'll take like one question, because I know I'm over time. And I'll just let you know, eventually, real soon now, I'm going to join the 21st century and launch a blog. And it's going to be called Graybeard's Treasure, because, well, my beard's gray.